I just watched Sarah load the last suitcase into her SUV, and the only thing she threw at me before slamming the door was that I officially stopped being a husband to her the second I handed the keys to my truck to a reseller just to bail my father out of the mess he got into because of his own sheer stupidity. She told me that I chose an old loser over our children's future, and now she's driving to her mother's place, taking our sons with her, because she can no longer trust a man who liquidates family assets behind her back, even though just a month ago we were planning our first vacation in 5 years. It all started exactly 3 weeks ago when my father, Jim, called me at 2 in the morning, and I knew immediately from the shaking in his voice that it was a total disaster because he never calls me just to talk. He was sobbing into the phone, struggling to find the words, and told me that he had mortgaged his house to fund some can't-miss real estate deal through an old acquaintance of his who ended up vanishing with every cent, leaving my father with a $40,000 debt that had to be paid within a month. Otherwise, the bank would throw him onto the street. I sat there in my kitchen in total darkness, listening to my 56-year-old father, the man who spent his whole life teaching me how to be strong, literally begging me for help because he had nowhere else to turn and was terrified of ending up on the sidewalk in his old age. The next morning, I tried to talk to Sarah, but the moment I mentioned my father's problems, she immediately went on the defensive, reminding me how many times Jim had let us down before, like when he forgot to pick the kids up from school or when he asked for money for roof repairs that actually went toward lottery tickets. She was right, and I knew it, but this time was different because we were talking about the roof over his head, and I couldn't just stand by and watch his life turn to ash, even if he was the one who lit the match. We argued until we were hoarse for 3 days straight. Sarah screamed that our savings were untouchable because we were saving for Leo and Toby's college funds, and that I had no right to put the interests of an irresponsible adult above the interests of our own innocent children. I felt backed into a corner because on one side was my wife demanding loyalty and financial stability, and on the other was my father who looked like he was ready to just give up and walk into the woods if I didn't step in. On the 4th day, I was driving to work in my Dodge Ram, a truck I'd bought only 6 months ago and had put so much work and money into, and I realized that this truck was the only liquid asset I owned personally that I could sell quickly without touching our joint accounts. I pulled into a used car dealership just to see what they'd offer, and when the appraiser gave me a number that covered almost the entire debt my father owed, something inside me broke, but I felt a strange sense of relief mixed with a cold, paralyzing dread about what I was about to do. I signed the papers and sold the truck that same afternoon without even calling Sarah, because I knew if I did, she would find a way to stop me, and I simply handed the check to my father, who looked at me like I had given him a second life, but I didn't feel like a hero. That evening I took a taxi home, and when Sarah asked where my truck was, I told her the truth while looking her straight in the eyes, hoping she would see my pain and understand why I couldn't do anything else. But instead of sympathy, I saw nothing but coldness and disgust in her eyes. She didn't scream. She just started packing her things in silence, and the sound of those cabinets opening and the rustle of clothes in the quiet house was louder than any explosion to me because I realized that in trying to save the past, I had just finished destroying my entire future. Now the house is disturbingly quiet, and I'm sitting on the floor of an empty living room where my sons were playing just yesterday, trying to wrap my head around how, in just 3 weeks, I went from a successful family man to a lonely guy with no car, no wife, and a massive hole in his heart that no amount of gratitude from my father can ever fix. I'm looking at my phone, seeing a missed call from Jim, and I don't even have the energy to press the button because the price of his survival turned out to be much higher than $40,000. And I have no idea how I'm supposed to make it to the end of this month without completely losing my mind. It has been exactly 8 days since Sarah left, and the silence in this house is starting to feel like a physical weight on my chest every time I walk through the front door. I spent the first 4 days just sitting in the dark because I didn't see the point in turning on the lights if there was no one there to see them, and the realization that my children aren't in the next room breathing softly in their sleep is a kind of torture I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. I had to start taking the city bus to work, which adds 2 hours to my daily commute, and every morning I stand there at the stop with people who look just as broken as I feel, thinking about how my Dodge Ram is probably already sitting on some lot with a for sale sign in the window. My coworkers keep asking me why I'm suddenly using public transport, and I've had to make up some pathetic lie about my truck being in the shop for a major engine overhaul because I'm too ashamed to tell them that I traded my dignity and my marriage for my father's mistakes. I went to see my father, Jim, 3 days ago to see how he was holding up now that the debt was paid, and I expected to see a man filled with some kind of profound gratitude or at least a sense of awareness regarding what his situation cost me. Instead, I found him sitting on his porch, drinking a beer and watching the sunset like he didn't have a care in the world, and when he saw me walk up the driveway, sweaty and exhausted from the bus ride, he just nodded and asked if I wanted a drink. We sat there for an hour, and he barely mentioned Sarah or the kids. He just kept talking about how he was going to get back on his feet, and how this was all just a temporary setback in his grand plan for financial independence. I looked at the house I had just saved, seeing the peeling paint and the overgrown lawn, and I felt a sudden, violent surge of resentment because I had sacrificed my entire world so he could keep sitting on that porch and dreaming about his next big score. He doesn't even know that Sarah left me, or if he does, he's doing a damn good job of pretending it's not a big deal, and I couldn't bring myself to tell him because I didn't want to hear him offer me some hollow apology that wouldn't change a single thing. The only communication I've had from Sarah was a single, cold text message telling me that she had changed her phone number and that if I wanted to talk to the kids, I had to go through her mother, Eleanor, which is basically a death sentence for my sanity. Eleanor has hated me since the day we got engaged because she always thought Sarah was marrying down. And now I've given her the perfect ammunition to prove that I'm a failure who can't provide for his family or make rational decisions. I called Eleanor's house yesterday, and she let the phone ring for a long time before picking up just to tell me that the boys were doing much better now that the tension in the house is gone, and that Sarah is already looking at divorce lawyers in the city. Every word out of her mouth felt like a knife being twisted in my ribs, and the worst part is that I can't even argue with her because, on paper, I look like a lunatic who prioritized a gambling, irresponsible father over the stability of his own household. I've started looking through my father's old financial records that he left scattered in his home office, trying to understand how a $40,000 debt could just appear out of nowhere, and the more I dig, the less sense the real estate deal story makes. There are no contracts, no emails from this old acquaintance, and no record of any property listings. There are only ATM withdrawal receipts and handwritten notes about investments that look more like a list of sports bets than a business plan. A sick feeling is growing in the pit of my stomach that the man I ruined my life for didn't just get unlucky. He might have been lying to me about where the money went from the very beginning, and if that's true, then I haven't just lost my wife, I've been the world's biggest fool. I haven't confronted him yet because I'm terrified of what the answer might be, and I'm not sure I can handle another betrayal right now when I'm already struggling to get out of bed in the morning. The house feels colder every day, and I've stopped eating real meals, mostly just picking at whatever is in the pantry while I stare at the wall and wonder if there's a version of this month where I didn't sign those papers at the dealership. I keep thinking about the look on Leo's face when he saw me crying on the night Sarah packed the bags. And I wonder if he'll grow up remembering me as the hero who saved his grandfather or the coward who let his family fall apart over a piece of metal and some old man's pride. I have 17 days left in this month before the next mortgage payment is due on this house. A payment I'm not sure I can even make now that my savings are gone and Sarah's income is out of the picture, and the walls are closing in on me faster than I ever thought possible. I'm stuck in this loop of anger and regret, waiting for a phone call that might never come, while my father continues to act like I just did him a minor favor that we'll both forget by next summer. I found the truth yesterday, and it's so much worse than I ever imagined, making the loss of my wife and my truck feel like a sick joke played on me by the universe. I was back at my father's house while he was out running errands, and I decided to go through the trash bin in his garage because I saw some official-looking envelopes sticking out from under a pile of junk mail. What I found wasn't a bank foreclosure notice or a real estate contract, but a stack of final warnings from a local casino and several handwritten ledgers that proved Jim hadn't lost that $40,000 in a bad business deal at all. He had gambled it away over the course of 6 months, and the urgent debt he needed me to pay wasn't to a bank to save his house, but to a group of private lenders, basically bookies, who had started showing up at his door and threatening to break his legs. He didn't just ask me to save his home. He manipulated my love for him to pay off his gambling debts, knowing full well that I was risking my own marriage and my children's future to bail him out of a hole he dug himself for fun. I stood there in that cold garage, holding those crumpled papers in my shaking hands, and I felt a level of rage that I didn't think was possible for a human being to experience without physically exploding. I waited for him to come home, sitting on his porch in the dark, and when he finally pulled into the driveway in his beat-up sedan, he looked at me and knew immediately that the game was up. I didn't even let him get out of the car before I started screaming. demanding to know how he could look me in the eye and tell me those lies while he watched Sarah pack her bags and leave me. He didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. Instead, he got defensive and started shouting back that I should be grateful he only needed 40,000, and that as his son, it was my duty to protect him regardless of where the money went. He actually said that Sarah was looking for an excuse to leave anyway, and that I shouldn't blame him for my own failing marriage, which was the moment I realized the man I had worshipped my whole life was a hollowed-out shell of a person with no moral compass left. The confrontation turned physical when he tried to push past me to get into the house, and I ended up pinning him against the door, shouting into his face until my throat felt like it was bleeding. I told him I was done, that I would never give him another dime, and that I wanted him to tell Sarah the truth, so she would know I wasn't just being reckless with our money. But he just laughed a dry, bitter laugh and told me no one would believe a failure who can't even keep his own truck. I walked away from his house and started the long trek back to my empty home, because I don't have a car to drive away in, and every step I took felt like I was walking through wet cement. By the time I got back to my neighborhood, it was nearly midnight, and I saw a white envelope taped to my front door that looked like it had been delivered by a courier while I was out. I opened it inside, and my heart didn't just sink. It stopped, because it was a formal notice from Sarah's attorney stating that she is filing for a legal separation and seeking a temporary restraining order that prevents me from coming within 500 feet of her or the boys. The document cited financial abuse and unstable behavior, claiming that my decision to sell a major family asset without consent and give the proceeds to a known gambler was evidence that I am not fit to provide a safe environment for our children. Eleanor, her mother, clearly had her hand in this, providing witness testimony about my aggressive outbursts during our arguments. And now I'm looking at a legal battle I can't afford with a lawyer I don't have the money to hire. I tried to call Sarah, desperate to explain what I'd found out about my father, but the call went straight to a disconnected line, and I realized she had truly erased me from her life in less than 3 weeks. I'm sitting here now, staring at the empty spot in the driveway where my Dodge Ram used to be, and I realized that the $40,000 I gave my father didn't just pay a debt, it bought my total destruction. I have no vehicle. My bank account is dwindling because I'm paying for taxis and bus passes just to keep my job. And now I have a court date looming that will likely strip me of my rights to see Leo and Toby. The pressure is becoming unbearable, and the worst part is the realization that I am still technically responsible for the mortgage on this house, which I can't pay alone, meaning I'm about to lose the roof over my head just like I thought my father was. I've reached out to a few friends for help, but as soon as they hear that Sarah left and that I sold my truck to give money to Jim, they get real quiet and make excuses to hang up, because no one wants to be associated with a guy who's spiraling this fast. I am completely alone, surrounded by the ghosts of a life I had worked 10 years to build, and I can feel the last bit of my self-control starting to snap as the month reaches its final, brutal week. I woke up on the 24th day of this nightmare to a phone call from a private investigator who told me that the dealership where I sold my Dodge Ram is suing me for fraud because they discovered a secondary lien on the vehicle that I didn't even know existed. Apparently, my father hadn't just begged me for the $40,000. He had already used my name and a forged power of attorney 3 months ago to take out a high-interest title loan on my truck to cover his earlier losses. This means the money I received from the sale was technically stolen from the title company, and now the dealership is demanding the full amount back immediately or they are going to the police to file criminal charges for grand larceny and fraud. I sat on the edge of my bed with the phone pressing against my ear, feeling the room spin as I realized that by trying to be a good son, I had unknowingly become a criminal in the eyes of the law. I didn't even have time to process the threat of prison before I received a package from Sarah's lawyer that contained something far more devastating than divorce papers or a restraining order. It was a medical report and a sonogram from an appointment Sarah had 2 days before she left, showing that she is nearly 10 weeks pregnant with our 3rd child. A secret she was planning to tell me during that vacation we were supposed to take. She had written a short, handwritten note on the back of the sonogram that said she was terrified to bring another life into a home where the father is addicted to his own destruction, and that she would rather raise 3 children alone than let them grow up watching me be a doormat for a man who has no soul. Seeing that tiny, grainy image of my unborn child while standing in a house that is about to be foreclosed on and facing potential jail time made me feel a level of despair that is physically painful, like my chest is being crushed by a hydraulic press. I had to make a choice, and it was a choice that would define the rest of my life. I could go to the police and report my father for the forgery and the identity theft, which would likely clear my name and get the dealership off my back, but it would also mean sending my 56-year-old father to a federal prison for a very long time. Or, I could take the fall, try to find a way to pay back the $40,000 I no longer have, and hope that Sarah eventually finds it in her heart to let me see my children before they forget what my voice sounds like. I took the bus to my father's house one last time to look him in the eye and ask him if he even realized that he was about to send his own son to prison for his gambling habits. I found him in the backyard, packing a suitcase into the trunk of his car, looking like a man who was getting ready to disappear before the bookies or the law caught up with him for good. He didn't even look surprised to see me. He just looked annoyed that I was interrupting his exit strategy, and when I told him about the title loan and the fraud charges, he had the audacity to tell me that I was young enough to bounce back and that he didn't have any years left to waste in a cell. He told me that if I really loved him, I would keep my mouth shut and let him get across the state line, and then he offered me $500 from a roll of cash in his pocket as if that would somehow make up for the fact that he had set my entire life on fire. I stood there watching him, the man who taught me how to throw a baseball and how to drive, and I realized that he wasn't a man at all, just a parasitic ghost who would keep feeding on me until there was nothing left but bone. He got into his car and started the engine, leaving me standing in the exhaust fumes, and as he drove away, I realized I had exactly 6 hours before the dealership's deadline to decide whether I was going to be a loyal son or a father who fought for his own children. I walked to the nearest police station, my mind racing through every memory of my childhood, trying to find one reason to protect him, but all I could see was the sonogram of the baby I might never get to hold and the empty bedrooms of the sons I had already lost. I sat in the waiting room for 2 hours, watching the clock tick down, knowing that once I spoke to a detective, there would be no going back and Jim would spend his final years behind bars because of my testimony. The moral weight of it was suffocating because even after everything, a part of me felt like a traitor for even being there, but then I thought about Sarah and the life we were supposed to have. I finally stood up when they called my name, but just as I was about to walk through the door to the interrogation room, my phone buzzed with a notification that made my heart drop. It was a message from Sarah's mother, Eleanor, saying that Sarah was in the hospital with complications and that I needed to stay as far away as possible if I didn't want to make things worse. I stood there, frozen between the detective waiting to take my statement and the door leading back to the street, realizing that every second I spent trying to save myself was a second I wasn't there for the people who actually mattered. I walked into that interrogation room and spent 4 hours giving the detective every detail of my father's life that I had previously tried to hide. I handed over the ledgers I found in the garage, the gambling notices, and the forged documents Jim had used to steal the title to my truck. It didn't feel like justice, and it didn't feel like a relief. It just felt like I was finally pulling the trigger on a gun I had been holding to my own head for weeks. The detective told me that my cooperation would likely prevent criminal charges against me, but that the money I received from the dealership was still considered tainted, and I would have to find a way to pay it back or lose everything I had left in the civil courts. By the time I walked out of the station, the sun was coming up on the 30th day since this nightmare began, and I felt like a ghost walking through a world I no longer belonged to. I ignored the restraining order and went straight to the hospital where Sarah was being held. I didn't care about the legal consequences anymore because I figured if I was going to lose my freedom, I might as well lose it while trying to see my wife. I found Eleanor sitting in the waiting room, and when she saw me, she stood up ready to call security, but I just handed her the police report and the statement I had signed against my father. I told her that Jim was likely being arrested at that very moment and that I had chosen my children over the man who raised me. She didn't apologize. Eleanor isn't the type to admit she was wrong. But she sat back down and told me that Sarah was in room 412 and that the doctors had managed to stabilize the pregnancy, though the stress had nearly caused a miscarriage. I stood in the doorway of Sarah's room for a long time, watching her sleep. She looked so small and exhausted, and for the first time in my life, I realized that my loyalty to my father wasn't a virtue. It was a form of cowardice that had almost killed my unborn child. When she finally opened her eyes and saw me, there were no tears and no dramatic reunions. She just looked at me with a profound, hollow sadness and asked if it was over. I told her it was, that Jim was gone and that I was going to spend the rest of my life paying back every cent he had stolen from us. We didn't hold hands, and she didn't tell me she loved me. She just said she needed more time to decide if she could ever look at me without seeing the man who had abandoned her when she needed him most. Jim was picked up by state troopers at a motel near the border 2 days later. He called me from the county jail, crying and calling me a Judas, telling me that he would die in prison and that it would be my fault. I listened to his voice for 30 seconds before I hung up and blocked the number, and that was the last time I spoke to my father. The bank eventually took the house because I couldn't keep up with the payments while paying off the dealership and the title company. So I moved into a tiny, one-bedroom apartment on the edge of town. I'm working 60 hours a week now, taking the bus everywhere, and every Saturday I get 4 hours of supervised visitation with Leo and Toby at a local park. It's been exactly 31 days since Jim first called me in the middle of the night. In 1 month, I went from having a home, a wife, 2 sons, and a third on the way, to living in a room where the only furniture is a folding chair and a mattress on the floor. Sarah and I are in mediation now, and while she hasn't pushed through with the divorce yet, she hasn't invited me back home either. We talk about the kids and the bills, and occasionally she'll tell me how the pregnancy is going, but the warmth is gone. It's like we're 2 strangers who happen to share a history of trauma. I sold my soul to buy my father a few more weeks of freedom, and in return, I bought myself a lifetime of regret. I sit here tonight looking at the sonogram Sarah let me keep, and I think about the word family. I used to think it meant protecting the people you love no matter what they did, but now I know that's a lie. Sometimes, protecting your family means cutting off the people who share your blood to save the people who share your life. I saved my father's house for exactly 3 weeks before he lost it anyway, and in the process, I burned down the only thing that actually mattered. I'm 34 years old. I have nothing to my name but a mountain of debt and a criminal record that hasn't been processed yet, and I'm starting over from zero. People on the internet always talk about doing the right thing, but they never tell you that sometimes the right thing feels exactly like losing. I don't know if Sarah will ever come back, and I don't know if my sons will ever respect me again, but I do know one thing. I am finally done being Jim's son, and maybe, if I work hard enough, I might eventually become a man.